Matt, are you really gonna do an entire lesson on borders and dividers? Yes, I am. And here's why. Borders and dividers, they're gonna be another one of those really small individual details that they just kind of all add up to make a big difference on the overall impact of your design. And there's a law of common region, one of these Gestalt principles, and it talks about elements are perceived in groups if they're sharing an area with a clearly defined boundary. So not only is this a visual thing, but it's just a psychological thing to group elements together, to have boundaries, to have dividers. And so we want to create borders and dividers that first and foremost function very well in regards to the content that they are separating and dividing, but we also want them to look really good. So let's just dive into Figma and start going over all the different types of borders and dividers. I've got a screenshot here from the settings app in iOS, and I want to point out when you bring in this screenshot into Figma, it's about this big relative to when you create a new frame inside of Figma. If I zoom way in here, I draw a rectangle, I've got a 1x1 pixel, and if I divide by 3, which is what you design at when you design at 1x, you can see that now if I zoom way in and I draw a 1x1 pixel, it's gonna be really large compared to that. So when you're designing on these big Retina devices, you have the ability to go with a, let's see, I'm gonna actually draw a line just because it's a little bit easier to show. So that's a 1 pixel line. So these dividers are actually a 0.33 line. And if I go with the same color, you can try to line them up, but it's a little bit hard because you're not quite on a pixel edge. But that's just one quick little super detailed example of a border thickness in iOS. So if I'm dividing some content, and generally like in the CCC range, that's gonna be a good color to use. You could even go up to DDD, and you probably don't wanna go lighter than E. Kind of depends on how thick you're gonna go. So the thicker you go with your border, the lighter the color you can get away with. But if we're gonna go with like a super thin iOS style 0.33, then we can select this color. You can see it's a C6, C6, C8. And you can see they're throwing in a tiny value of blue into that color, so it's not a pure gray. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just gonna go C6, C6. I'm just gonna use full grayscale here. And that is 0.33. But you can see if I were gonna do 0.5 there, and if I duplicate that and do 0.1, see this same color, just putting this side by side. So, and you know what? Let's go ahead and add the 8 on the end to make these the exact same color. This and this are exactly the same. Same color, same size. This and this are the exact same color, but slightly larger size, like a 0.55 or 0.5 rather, half a pixel. And same thing here, same color, but it's just a full 1 pixel stroke. And this would actually, this would get interpreted into like this would end up being closer to 3 pixels. If I were gonna go and I wanted to really see what this looked like at 3x, and I'm gonna copy this over here. So if I designed a 1 pixel border for an iPhone Retina screen, this is what it would get translated to. So let's just put that in place. That's pretty good right in there. So you can tell that that's much thicker. Much thicker of a divider, almost unnecessarily large and unnecessarily dark. So that subtle difference of changing the width to be 0.33 instead of 1 point is that much of a difference. So your color and your thickness are going to play together to create quite a large amount of contrast. So again, the higher you go in thickness, the lighter you can go in color. But the thinner you go in size, you want to bump up the darkness a little bit. There's not really a golden formula that you can rely on for darkness of borders. It's more of a gut feel, but just try out some different colors and make sure you're not going too dark, especially when you have a big list of things like this. A lot of times it is more of a style preference type thing. You have to consider your overall design direction, and are you going to go with this kind of chunky, big border style dividers, or is that a little bit overkill? And so you try to think about, are you going to use, maybe you only use dividers for dividing out main sections and not for a list of things. But it's something you just kind of constantly play with. All right, so let's take a look at another example here. I'm going to create kind of like a comment system. So let's do an avatar here, and let's get another avatar for this one, and might as well do one more. Let's do, we'll do one more. Okay, there we go. Is that Demi Moore? I think that's Demi Moore. Okay, now we are going to type in here, dummy text generator. I'd rather use actual words. All right, so I'm gonna paste in just some random text here. I'm gonna make this 16 pixel. We'll do medium. All right, so we got that at 16. And I'm gonna move this over. We'll do like, I'm gonna do 20 on the edge and then 12 from there for now. Might actually change that to regular. And let's make this a little less. All right, so let's imagine this is like a comment section, and each one of these people are leaving a comment. So let's actually also give this guy a name here. So I'm going to use the same exact type size just to keep it nice and clean. Move this like 4 pixels, and random name generator, full name, might as well. And I'm going to top align this. There we go. I want to do 20. I want to make sure this is 20. So if I actually put I guess the stroke's not going to work on everything. If you had all these in frames like this, and then we grabbed each frame and we put a stroke on the frame, this would actually kind of show you a little bit better about how I'm trying to position all these things. I might want something like that for the name. And also, especially if I did outside, that would be a little bit more. So remember, always try to think about your layout as these boxes here, even if you have the text and everything. And let's also give ourselves a little timestamp. We'll say like 5 minutes ago. And we're gonna line that up there. Right align, Command Option R. More than likely, we don't need a ton of space for the timestamp. And that'll just give us more room for the name. That way, if it got to be like a really long name, you could do something like, you could just truncate it out. And then once you have all of your stuff in place, then it makes a little more sense. And we could probably even go down to 14 on that. And let's go regular. Maybe this. I'm actually gonna get these out of frames just because it's sometimes harder to design with frames. I just wanted to make those frames just so you could see. And we'll put this at like 7.5. Maybe we'll leave these two at, put this at 7.5 and leave these at the same color. Or not, just playing around here. And now I kind of want to see a little more space right there, which means I'm going to need to go 1, 2, 3, 4 on that side. Okay, so now onto our dividers. Now that we have this out, of the way. I've got this top aligned here. Before we start talking about sections versus similar items, I want to talk about this. I think this is a little more relevant for right now. So should you do a border or a shadow or a separate layer? And what I mean by that is, do you want to line like this? So now if we group all of this, we've got a little line, which is our border, which is perfectly fine. And there's not really a right answer for this necessarily. It just depends on what you prefer. Let's go C6 just to kind of model what iOS did. And remember, we could go a little lighter since we are using a 1 pixel line. And let's put this at like 20. Since this is 20, we'll do that at 20 as well. So this is one option with the line. And another option would be creating a big background. All right, sending that to the back. And I want this 20 from the top. And I want that 20 there. So now I'll make this white. And another thing we could do here, we could actually just say, let's do an inner shadow. And let's make it 0 blur and a -1. So it comes from the bottom. Let's give it 100%. And then let's change this shadow to C6. And remember, we actually went to D for that one. So now we have this as a line, and we have this one as an inner shadow on this big background shape. Now, I personally like to use, when I can, I like to use the background shape like this, because this makes a nicer component than this does. Because if I turn this into a component and I turn this into a component and then I have duplicates, the instances, you can see like I like my components to snap in place like Lego blocks in an overall layout. Whereas this one, you could go in and add some negative space into it, but that ends up becoming a little bit more of a hassle. So I actually prefer, unless things get too complicated, I like to have the background in there by default. And if you don't like using the inner shadow, if you find it confusing, you could definitely turn that off. And then, and I'm gonna actually bring this back in. You could turn that inner shadow off, and then you can paste in your divider. And this is honestly another great way to do it. It's just kind of a personal preference. Sometimes I will even, instead of having this border, I might actually create another shape and call this border instead. And then I might just have my inner shadow on that instead of having the border. So it's the exact same look. It's just more of, do you like having this tiny shape that you can select? Also, if I wanted to make this larger, I could just do that with a stroke. But then if it works the exact same way, sometimes it's just easier to click into that shape right there versus trying to hit that tiny stroke. And then I can just change this to -2 or 3. And that doesn't actually affect the space in between. Now, it does affect, like, this is actually 16 pixels of margin here because it's actually measuring all the way to the edge. The only way that would be different was if we put put it as a drop shadow, then you'd have 20 pixels of white space and then the drop shadow. But it's just kind of whatever you prefer. I like to put it inside. So I'm gonna leave that at 1 like that for now. Like I said, you can have your individual border or not. And that way, if we do have this as the component, let's go ahead and move our master there and make a copy. So now, if I wanted these to be snapped against each other, I could just put these at 0. And I can copy the fill and then hit paste right there. So click the fill, copy, and I'm gonna paste. Oh, and if we really wanted to get, we could copy and paste all the fills here, and then we could just toggle the visibility, but we're not gonna do all that. So copy the fill, paste the fill. We could have a border here, and sometimes you might want this entire background to have like a bottom border, so you can play around with the full background versus the full border, and that way on the last child you might have a full border on the back, or maybe your full border doesn't quite do that and you have a slightly different one that's maybe it's not there at all. So it's helpful to have the ability to toggle on and off that last border, which is kind of what I'm getting at on this one here, on this call out. So it's just an easy way to kind of toggle that last bottom border. But for the most part, it's something you can play with, whether or not you prefer the individual border. That way you can use a stroke instead of the shadow, but it's really ends up becoming more of a personal preference. And then at this point, whether or not you're playing with the border, actual border, or the shadow, you can always come back into your master and say, well, maybe what if it was like all the way to the avatar? Does that look a little bit better? You just have to remember which component is which. So a lot of times I tend to prefer the borders that are separating the content. I feel that it's a bit more scannable. That way you have this clean, smooth edge. Whereas if you were to do something like this, it breaks it up a lot more. So maybe if you have a lot heavier, more dense content and information, you might want the stronger border. But I find this one to be right in here. Let me try to redo. There we go. I find this one to be slightly better. I just kind of prefer that indented look. And if you also wanted to, you could even experiment with not going all the way. Sometimes it's more of, if you wanted to be more iOS style, you would indent the left side and push the right all the way. If you wanted it to be a little bit more styled for a brand, you know, there's this subtle difference between how you style a border in combination with some of the colors and border radius. Like these little elements are going to build together to kind of set the overall look and feel. But look, you could imagine if I were to take these and let's go here. Just imagine if I grab this border and I let's put an inner shadow on that. And let's make it come from the top just to show kind of what it looks like if it was, let's make it like AA. There we go. We'll make this one A as well. So it's only 2 letters difference from the color, but you'll notice, you know, if I do this, all of a sudden it's like border city, like a lot of borders. All right, so you can see there's a pretty big difference between this and even this. It's simply just changing the border color, but it's a lot busier. It's a lot more segmented and broken up. And that kind of leads me to pointing out using negative space only. So it's definitely worth considering getting rid of all of your borders and seeing if your content makes sense without the extra borders. So in this particular example, let's just put these side by side. I'll make a copy of these. Bring them down here. So just in terms of just pure cleanliness, I definitely like this one a little bit better. If we're talking about a Twitter timeline and we need to put in, you know, the heart and the retweet and the other icons here, and it becomes a little bit, there's more information, then it might be too much to not have the border. We might need to bring in that divider. Now let's check out what this looks like with a 0.33, so negative 0.33. C6. So even that, you can tell that the border is still doing its job right here. This is just very, very, very subdued and subtle compared to the 1 pixel dark border. So if you're ever having trouble with border colors, you can always take screenshots of apps and see how thick are they going with their borders, how wide is it, what color is it, how does that play off the background. You can tell there's a little bit of a blue hue in the background as well here. So you don't have to completely copy everything verbatim, but it is definitely helpful to see how that works together. And then you can start playing with changing up your negative space to make it a little tighter. But you definitely kind of want to avoid these really dark borders. And the other thing I want to point out here, a comment section might not quite have a big rollover state, but that's also one of the reasons why I like to do these inner borders, is because the rollover state will often kind of cover that up. So let's say we wanted to have kind of an extreme rollover state just to show an extreme example. Well, I guess we don't need to go too extreme. We'll do like a gray rollover state and we'll hide that. So this is one thing that you kind of have to consider here. There can be a little bit of a weird border thing happening here. And also if you were to leave the border there, if I change this, it's not very, very noticeable, but it is a little off-putting. So what I would either do, I would either say, okay, if you roll over any of these, we need to disable the one above and also the one on that. So that would be kind of an implementation issue, but you can see that it's just a lot cleaner if you have the border kind of going away on rollover. And there's a number of ways to do that with implementation, whether you decrease the border to 0 on the actual one, and you can do, the previous child. There's a number of ways to implement it, but as long as you're kind of calling that out and being very mindful of the way that would work, that would be kind of one of the aha gotcha moments with the borders, especially when you're doing something with the indented border. You just have to make sure you're kind of aware of what's happening on the top and bottom, especially for the rollover states. And we kind of covered indented versus full width. And the different styles, like I said before, it can be really helpful to experiment with different styles if you're planning on going like with a slightly heavier branded type version. You might go with a 2 pixel border, but maybe this one is incredibly light. So you can get away with going with a really light border. This is F0. I wouldn't go much lighter than F5 because it starts to get really hard to perceive. So that's a -2, that's a -4. And you could imagine if I change the font to, maybe it was just a bolder type of font, and I was going lighter with this. It's probably way too bold for actual text, but grab this one as well, 9.5. That's more of the AA large score, so it's not really passing accessibility. But you can see, if I'm playing with the darker style, and I mean, really, I could have even just kept this text as is like that. Maybe this one goes back down to bold, or whatever it was on the other one, regular. But maybe these are extra bold. Maybe you have the chunky extra bold, and then you have these big chunky borders. It kind of does the same thing, and this is kind of a neat style. It just depends on the design direction that you have on your app. So if you want to go more system iOS, you can do these tiny little borders. But if you're going to go thicker with a 1 pixel line, you need to remember to go lighter, You need to remember about the rollovers and consider some alternate styles. You could even make these colors, or you could just remove them altogether. It really just depends. And then if you're kind of going for sections versus individual items. So this is kind of an example of dividers within grouped items. These are all kind of comments. But what if we had a big section up here that was like, hey, write your comment up here. And maybe this was, maybe it's the same exact style. So I can copy Command Option C on this background, and then Command Option V on that one. Maybe it makes sense to do a big 4-pixel divider, or maybe even like a 6-pixel divider. And then maybe these are like 2. And so now we're kind of setting up this border and divider language where we're saying, okay, if you're writing a comment, then that is going to be, let's say that is the person who is logged in, and maybe this is super duper placeholder text. So we do like 9.5. Assume this is like an input field area. And now, since the functionality is much different between here and here, this might warrant a completely different border style. But we're still trying to be mindful of, okay, this is a very certain type of border at -6. So we've got a 6-pixel border, very light gray, but enough to create a very significant border there. And then we have our -2 right here. And just to show another option of this, there is also the ability to do no borders on any of this. And instead we have our background be 5F0F0, say that's our background. And let's make sure we bring in this background here. So then we can actually just use our negative space only to create these borders. That's yet another way to do it. And there's not really a right or wrong way, especially, it just depends on how you want to do it. So now we can move all of these together. We've got 2 pixels between everything. Could even do 2 pixels right here as well. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that is enough. And you could do the background module there, but it's kind of nice to have it where they're all their kind of own elements. That way, when you do get into design system type things, you have these blocks that can kind of lock in place. And actually, I would probably prefer having the border like inner shadow versus having this background area, because if you do this, then you have to keep in mind this negative space. And if someone was just trying to snap these things in place, like if I had these as my components, these are all my design system components, and I want to just pop them in and build them all. If I just want to snap them together with 0 pixel margin, there ends up not being a border. So even though it could be easier to make it without a true border. So it's probably going to be a little bit easier and a little bit scalable, a little bit more scalable, more future-proof if you kind of bake in the border to the component, as opposed to the border living in a completely separate thing. So if you start to think about your items as individual components, you kind of develop these little rules for the style and for the appearance of the borders for the rollovers. So there's a lot of different ways you can handle it, but you just kind of have to be mindful of the space, mindful of the thickness, mindful of the color. And also, are you dividing grouped elements or are you dividing sections? And that will kind of drive the style of the border and how thick it might be or how dark the color might be. Maybe you go full black on one and a lighter gray on the other. But it's kind of like this mental system that you're trying to build up when you kind of create this component system. For homework, I want you to do something similar that we just covered, but instead of doing comments and a comment section, maybe it's a list of contacts. So you have an avatar, a name, maybe a title in the smaller gray, and maybe a kind of an arrow that links to a different place. It could be a sidebar, or it could be a big website, or you can do a mobile screen. It's kind of up to you, whatever you want to go for. And just go through, make a list of like 5 to 10 people and play with 0.5 pixel borders, 0.33 pixel borders. Vary the widths, the style. If you want to do modules and shadows, play around with maybe 3 to 5 different options once you just get that first list in place. And then you can kind of play with the borders, the space, and kind of get a feel for dividing sections. And that'll kind of just give you a good foundation for setting a larger stage for borders. But it's important, just remember, don't overdo it. Sometimes a negative space is enough of a divider, and just because you don't have an actual border or an actual divider doesn't mean that the content isn't divided enough with the negative space. So maybe you do 3 to 5 versions with varying degrees of negative space in between each of them, and then try another one with very tiny borders, and just kind of figure out what you like more. So border homework, get started, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.